Crowfoot High School loomed against the jagged Washington tree line like a brutalist monolith of stained concrete. To the locals in Oak Haven, it was just an ugly school building, but to Pamela "Pam" Michaels, it was a fluorescent-lit tomb. The rain didn't so much fall as it stuck, forming a heavy gray shroud over the structure. Pam often thought the building looked more like a military bunker than a place of learning, a fitting irony for a woman who felt like she was constantly under siege by a world that didn't want her. As she pushed her yellow mop bucket through the main hallway, the silence was suddenly cut by a sharp click and a low hum. A single bank of motion sensor lights buzzed to life, flickering with a nauseating blue-white strobe that made the shadows dance. Pam stopped to adjust her thick black-rimmed glasses. She hated these glasses. They were a shield she used to hide her eyes that were a dull, shielded silver. She often reflected on the path that brought her here. Only a year ago she had been a rising star in her master's program, obsessed with the linguistics of the New Kingdom. She had spent nights deciphering the Book of the Dead and dreaming of the sands of Luxor. But the academic world was cold. Grants dried up and a prestigious museum internship went to a girl whose father donated a wing. Now at 22 her hands were red and chapped from bleach instead of white-gloved for handling papyrus. She was a ghost shift janitor, a girl with a head full of dead languages and a heart full of industrial-grade citrus cleaner. Moments later, Pam moved through the boys' locker room with a mechanical, joyless efficiency. She didn't hum or listen to music. She simply breathed as she worked, the smell of old sweat and floor wax filling her lungs. Suddenly she froze. A dark, viscous puddle sat in the center of the communal shower floor, steaming and thick. While any other person would have gagged, Pam merely let out a puff of exhausted breath. She had seen enough biological messes in this school to be numb to them. She dipped her mop into the steaming bleach water and began to scrub at the stubborn tar-like fluid. As the mop moved through the mess, a low tectonic vibration hummed through the floor tiles, vibrating up into her teeth. "Filters clogged again," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the cavernous room. She thought back to her mother, who always said Pam was born under a heavy moon, implying she was destined for a life of burden. Looking at the black sludge, Pam felt the weight of that prophecy. She remained focused on the floor, unaware of the shadow crouched like a gargoyle atop the lockers, a figure 7 feet tall and darker than the surrounding gloom. It was Ak, the prehistoric Alpha King, a relic of the 1200 BC sands she had once studied. In the deepest, most forbidden layers of Egyptian lore Pam had read of the Inpu, the original lord of the sacred land. To the modern world he was known as Anubis, the jackal-headed god of embalming, but in his prehistoric primal form he was simply Ak, the opener of the ways. He was the divine judge who weighed hearts against a feather, but here, trapped in the cold concrete of Washington, he was a hungry, spectral king. He had been watching her for weeks, fascinated by the scent that clung to her despite the scent of lie. To him she was not a janitor but a lamb for the slaughter, scrubbing the floors of peasants while the god of the dead waited in the rafters to reclaim his sacrifice. A thick, clear strand of saliva fell from the ceiling, landing on the tile right next to her boot with a sharp sizzle. The floor wax bubbled and turned black instantly as the stone-cold smell of 3,000-year-old rot began to overpower the scent of bleach. Pam stopped scrubbing and looked down at the bubbling wax. Her academic mind registered the chemical reaction, but her instinctual mind felt the predator above. She slowly tilted her head back, her glasses sliding down her nose just as the motion sensor lights reached the end of their timer. With a final clack, the room was plunged into total darkness. In the blackness, 2 pulsing amber globes ignited near the ceiling. They didn't blink, reflecting perfectly in Pam's silver eyes. A wet, guttural sound vibrated through the air as a massive throat cleared itself of ancient dust. A voice like grinding granite spoke a single word in Middle Egyptian, Seshmet. Pam's heart thudded heavily against her ribs. He recognized the word, scribe. It was a title of honor in the world she had lost, but coming from this beast, it sounded like a death sentence. She knew the phonetics of the 19th dynasty perfectly. It was the language of the kings she had worshipped. She didn't scream, but her knuckles turned white as she gripped the handle of her mop bucket. The voice rumbled again from the darkness above her, the words dripping with a terrible regal authority. Thou art a strange daughter of the setting sun. In an instant the scholar was replaced by the prey. Pam bolted. She threw open the locker room door, letting it hit the wall with a metallic scream as she sprinted into the hallway. Her heavy key ring jingled like a frantic alarm bell with every step, a sound that she once found comforting but now felt like a beacon for the monster. Behind her, echoing in the dark, came the heavy wet slap of massive paws hitting the linoleum in a 30-minute hunt that was only just beginning. Pam surged into the main corridor, her breath coming in ragged, shallow bursts that misted in the frigid night air. The heavy metal doors of the locker room groaned on their hinges behind her, marking the boundary between the mundane world and the nightmare she had just glimpsed. Above her, the flickering motion sensor lights struggled to keep pace with her frantic movement, strobing like a dying star and casting her shadow in long, distorted jerks against the locker faces. Every rhythmic thud slap of the paws behind her acted as a hammer against her memory, cracking open the vault of her abandoned studies. She remembered the scrolls of the 19th dynasty, the ones detailing the Inpu, not the sanitized golden-masked protector of the pharaohs, but the primal prehistoric opener of the ways. He was the vanguard who tread the path between life and death before the first stone of the pyramids was ever quarried. In the ancient myths, his claws clicking on the limestone of the Duat heralded the arrival of the soul at the scales of judgment. The realization chilled her blood more than the Washington rain. The clicking she heard now on the linoleum was the sound of that very lore come to life. This was the opener, the deity who existed to transition the living into the dead. She was running through the halls of a high school, yet in her mind she was traversing the shifting sands of the Lycopolis, being herded toward an inevitable end. A sudden resonant vibration shook the ventilation shafts above her head, the metal groaning under a weight that defied physics. The voice returned, amplified by the ductwork until it seemed to originate from the very walls of the school. Thou art a strange daughter of the setting sun, Ak's voice rumbled, the Middle Egyptian vowels rolling with a regal, terrifying weight. He claimed that the light of the modern world had failed her, and that the shadows were the only kingdom left to her. Pam rounded the corner near the cafeteria, her boots skidding on a patch of floor she had polished only hours ago. She saw the amber glow of his eyes reflected in the glass of the trophy cases, a predatory fire that seemed to mock the plastic sports trophies within. He was moving through the vents now, the ceiling tiles buckling and cracking as he paced her. To him, this was a sacred ritual. He was the shepherd of souls, and she was the scribe whose story was supposed to be written in the very stars he had once commanded. The sound of his claws grew louder, a frantic, sharp staccato against the metal above. Pam realized with a jolt of horror that he was no longer just following her. He was directing her. Every snarl and every echo of his voice through the vents served to block the side exits, funneling her toward the center of the building. She felt the ancient authority in his tone, a command that expected total submission. To Ak, she was the human who was ignorant of her God, and he was the judge come to collect the debt of her blood. Pam let out a tiny sob of terror and fled toward the glass-paned front entrance, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Freedom lay just beyond the transparent barrier, where the rain-slicked parking lot offered a path back to the world of sanity. She slammed her shoulder into the heavy push bar, expecting the familiar click of the latch and the rush of cold Washington air. The bar remained motionless. A sharp, electronic hum emanated from the frame as red LEDs on the security panel blinked with a rhythmic mechanical pulse. The school was sealed. The school board had activated the magnetic locks, turning the brutalist fortress into a closed circuit of concrete and fear. Pam stood paralyzed, her reflection in the glass showing a woman whose thick glasses were fogged with the sweat of the hunted. Outside, the black sedan of her employers sat idling in the distance, and in it were witnesses to her execution. The silence of the lobby was broken by a heavy rhythmic thud slap echoing from the mezzanine above. AK had transitioned from the vents to the second-floor walkway. His obsidian weight made the steel railings groan, the sound vibrating down through the floor and into the soles of Pam's boots. She clutched her heavy key ring, the metal biting into her chapped palm. The jingling sound she once associated with her authority over the building had become a dinner bell. Every movement she made caused the brass keys to sing, a high-pitched beacon that signaled her exact coordinates to the prehistoric opener of the ways. She stared up at the dark balcony, where the amber fire of his gaze burned through the gloom. The lord of the sacred land was pacing the upper floor, his shadow stretching across the ceiling like a predatory shroud. He was the divine gatekeeper, and he had decreed that all exits were now illusions. The doors obey the master of the house, little scribe. AK's voice descended from the shadows, heavy with the weight of 3 millennia. He claimed that the keys she held were symbols of a servant, while the chains he wore were the ornaments of a king. He told her that her efforts to escape were merely movements in a sacred dance that he had choreographed at the dawn of time. Pam backed away from the locked glass, her keys clattering with every trembling step. The school had become a tomb, a sacrificial altar built of cinder blocks and linoleum. She realized that her role in this building was a lie. She was the designated offering, and the god of the dead was coming down the stairs to claim his due. The clock was ticking, and the hunter was finally descending to the ground floor. Pam retreated from the sealed entrance, her boots clicking a frantic retreat toward the only sanctuary she knew, the sprawling, silent library. She vanished into the maze of floor-to-ceiling shelves, seeking refuge within the history section. The air here was heavy with the scent of aging paper and binding glue, a familiar smell that usually offered her comfort but now felt like the dry breath of a tomb. She crouched in the deepest corner of the stacks, wedged between a shelf of Near Eastern archaeology and a massive collection of 19th-century cartography. The double doors of the library groaned open with a slow, deliberate creak. AK entered the room, his massive obsidian frame eclipsing the dim emergency lights. He began to stalk the aisles, his rhythmic footsteps causing the very floorboards to weep. With a casual, terrifying strength, he swept a clawed hand across a shelf, sending volumes of Egyptian history crashing to the floor. The sound of tearing paper and heavy bindings hitting the linoleum echoed like small explosions in the narrow space. "Thou seekest shelter among these withered leaves, Sekhmet?" AK's voice rumbled, vibrating through the metal shelf behind Pam's head. He claimed that she was a fool to worship the ink of men who had been dead for ages while the living god of the dead stood in her presence. He told her that these books were merely shadows of the glory he had actually lived, and that her master's degree was a shroud she had woven for herself. He continued to move through the rows, his amber eyes glowing between the gaps in the books, tracking the frantic silver of her own gaze. Pam saw a heavy claw pierce through the spine of a book on the New Kingdom, the serrated edge stopping inches from her face. The opener of the ways was dismantling her world, one shelf at a time. He mocked her devotion to the Dead Scrolls, stating that the knowledge she prized was a cage built by those who feared the blood in his veins. He claimed the ink on the pages was a pale imitation of the blood he intended to draw from her neck. Desperation drove her toward a small reinforced service window used for passing books to the return bin. She scrambled over a pile of fallen encyclopedias as Ak let out a guttural roar, his weight finally collapsing the entire row of history shelves behind her. The sound of wood splintering and metal buckling filled the room as the massive structure fell where she had been crouching only seconds before. Pam squeezed through the narrow window frame, her navy work shirt snagging on a jagged latch, and tumbled into the dark service corridor just as a massive, fur-matted paw crushed the wall where she had made her escape. The hunt moved now into the bowels of the building, toward the rising heat of the descent. Pam tumbled into the concrete stairwell, her lungs burning as she descended into the sweltering bowels of the school. The temperature rose with every flight, the air thick with the mechanical hum of the boiler room. By the time she reached the basement floor, the atmosphere was a suffocating weight, a dry and blistering heat that mimicked the midday sun of the Theban desert. Steam hissed from ancient, corroded valves, swirling around her like the restless ghosts of the Duat. A heavy, rhythmic thud echoed against the concrete walls as Ak entered the chamber. He moved with a newfound vitality, his frame absorbing the intense heat. The ghastly chains, wrapped around his neck and torso, began to pulse with a violent violet light, reacting to the approach of the midnight solstice. Every link of the spectral metal hummed with a low-frequency power that vibrated in Pam's very teeth. Ak's caustic drool fell in thick, heavy ropes, and wherever it touched the pressurized pipes, the iron groaned and burst into plumes of scalding white mist. The desert returns to claim its own little scribe. Ak's voice boomed through the steam, sounding like the shifting of 1,000 tons of sand. He claimed that the cold world of the living was a dream and that the burning heat of the underworld was the only reality. He told her that the chains she heard rattling were the fetters of a king waiting for his resurrection, and that her life force was the final offering required to shatter them. He stalked through the fog, his amber eyes glowing like twin suns through the white haze, herding her toward the massive, glowing furnaces at the center of the room. The intense heat began to take its toll on Pam's human veneer. A sharp crack echoed through the chamber as the lenses of her thick, black-rimmed glasses fractured under the thermal stress. The frames warped, sliding from her face and shattering against the floor. As the barrier fell away, a faint, crystalline glimmer of silver light began to emanate from her pupils, cutting through the steam. Pam gasped, her vision shifting as the world of concrete and pipes began to blur into a world of golden energy and ancient shadows. The blood in her veins was answering the call of the heat, bubbling beneath her skin like molten ore. Ak froze, his snout twitching as he caught the scent of the awakening power. He let out a roar of predatory triumph, savoring the terror emanating from Pam's body. He lunged through a wall of steam, driving her upward toward the gym for the final act of the hunt. Clawing her way up the final flight of stairs, her chest heaving, she burst through the double doors into the cavernous darkness of the gymnasium. The air here was vast and cold, a sharp contrast to the furnace of the basement. She scrambled to the center of the hardwood court, her bare eyes searching the shadows. The rhythmic squeak of her own sneakers echoed like a heartbeat until a massive, obsidian weight hit the floor behind her. Ak stepped into the dim light of the overhead emergency rafters, standing at his full 7-foot height. His body was a mountain of corded muscle, his fur matted with the dust of centuries and his skin as dark as volcanic glass. The violet light from his ghastly chains bathed the gym in a spectral hue, casting long, predatory shadows against the championship banners. He began to pace a wide circle around her, his movements fluid and regal. The god of the dead let out a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate the very foundations of the building. He spoke in his ancient tongue of the old times, describing the days when the Nile ran red with the offerings of 10,000 servants and the sun was a disk of fire he personally escorted across the heavens. He told her of the great halls of justice where he had sat upon a throne of ivory and gold, deciding the fate of empires with a single movement of his hand. He claimed that the concrete walls of this school were a pathetic cage for a being who had once commanded the winds of the Sahara. "The hour of the weighing is at hand, Sekhmet," Ak's voice boomed, the Middle Egyptian vowels echoing with the authority of a pharaoh. He stood tall, his amber eyes locked onto the silver fire in her own. He delivered his final decree, stating that the Hall of Two Truths had manifested here on this splintered wood. He told her that her heart was the weight and his hunger was the scale. He claimed that the feather of Ma'at was waiting to judge the purity of the blood she carried. He announced that the solstice had reached its peak and the debt of the ages was now due. Pam stood her ground, her silver gaze intensifying as the room began to hum with a power that rivaled his own. She felt something within her rising like a tide, matching the predatory heat of the god before her. Ak lowered his head, his snout wrinkling to reveal rows of serrated obsidian teeth. He claimed that her fear was the final seasoning for the feast of his resurrection. He coiled his powerful hind legs, the hardwood floor cracking beneath his claws, and prepared to lunge for the killing blow that would bridge the gap between their two worlds. The digital clock on the gymnasium wall flickered, the red segments bleeding into the final seconds of the hour. As the numbers aligned into a 000 at the stroke of midnight, the mechanical hum of the building ceased, replaced by a vacuum of absolute silence. Ike lunged. He was a blur of obsidian muscle and violet light, a prehistoric shadow crossing the distance in a single earth-shaking bound. He crashed into Pam with the force of a falling monument, his massive weight pinning her to the center of the hardwood court. His jaws opened wide, revealing a cavern of jagged teeth that smelled of the tomb and ancient spice. With a guttural snarl of triumph, AK sank his fangs deep into the side of Pam's neck. He claimed his prize, his throat working as he prepared to drain the life force he had hunted for 30 horrid minutes. He expected the sweet surrender of a human soul, believing his evolution into a physical god was only a swallow away. A heartbeat thumped, a heavy resonant sound that echoed through the vast gym like a war drum. Then came a second louder thrum that shook the championship banners and shattered the remaining glass in the trophy cases. The sound was the pulse of something ancient and dormant finally waking up. Just as AK's teeth met the resistance of her marrow, a deafening crack of thunder tore through the internal space of the gym, despite the clear ceiling. The sound was the voice of the sky responding to the earth. Pam's body arched beneath him, her fingers digging into the matted fur of his shoulders. She felt the searing pain of the bite transform into a rush of icy celestial energy. The violet light of AK's chains flickered and paled as a raw, white-hot power began to surge from the puncture wounds in her neck. The god of the dead froze, his amber eyes widening as he realized the blood he was drinking was a liquid silver fire that burned his throat. The hunt had reached its end, and the predator found his jaws locked onto a sun. The white-hot energy erupting from Pam's neck intensified into a blinding, celestial supernova that filled the gymnasium, bleaching the shadows into nothingness. The liquid silver fire surged upward, traveling through Ack's fangs and into his very core. A violent shockwave of pure primordial force blasted outward from Pam's reclining form, catching the 7-foot god in its wake. Ack was hurled across the hardwood court like a leaf in a gale, his obsidian body slamming into the bleachers with a thunderous crash that splintered the heavy wood into toothpicks. He slammed into the wall and left a gaping hole 3 feet wide. Pam rose slowly from the center of the gym floor, her movements fluid and devoid of her previous exhaustion. The jagged puncture wounds on her neck remained, but instead of crimson blood, they wept glowing trails of mercury that evaporated into silver mist. She stood tall, her oversized navy work shirt fluttering in a wind that came from within her. Her eyes were wide and uncovered, 2 brilliant orbs of liquid silver that illuminated the cavernous room with a terrifying lunar radiance. Ack scrambled to his feet among the wreckage of the bleachers, his massive frame trembling. The ghastly chains around his torso were now shattered remnants, their violet glow extinguished by the superior light. He stared at the woman he had hunted, his amber eyes wide with a realization that bordered on religious awe. The predator was now the supplicant, cowering in the presence of a power that predated even his own ancient sands. "Thou art a star fallen into the skin of a mortal," Ack whispered, his voice a ragged, terrified rasp of Middle Egyptian. He claimed that he had been blind to the truth, mistaking a sun for a mere scribe. He told her that his scales were broken and his judgment was void in the face of her divinity. He remained huddled in the shadows, his snout dripping with the silver fire that still scorched his throat. Pam backed away from him, nearly slipping on the hardwood floor beneath her feet. The opener of the ways had successfully opened a door, but he felt that the being that walked through it was far beyond his control. Ack bowed his head, his voice a final, haunting echo in the silent gym. "Thou art not human." The 22-year-old janitor shot out of the gym like a sparrow out of a trap. "I'm Luna, the writer behind this messy, silver-blooded nightmare. If you've been holding your breath since the boiler room descent, let me know by hitting that like and subscribe button. It really helps keep the story alive. I'm dying to know where you're all watching from, so drop your location in the comments. And seriously, if you want to see what Pam does now that she's the one holding the power, comment Pam below for the next episode. I've got plenty more chaos planned for Crowfoot High, and I'd love to have you along for the ride. Until next time.